Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which, among many other things, is still wrapped in a pandemic. It's hard to keep that in mind sometimes if you've been multiple vaccinated and boosted like me. But it's a lurking potentiality that's going to still keep coming at us. There's still these big vaccine gaps in the world, which I've written about and hosted webcasts on interminably. It's a human heated planet. This is evident around the world. Countries rich and poor experiencing unbelievable impacts, partly because of where and how we've built in the recent decades in areas of implicit hazard, partly because the climate is changing in ways that are changing extremes from heat to flood intensity to the like. And I have some wonderful guests today, too. Journalists, writers, essayists who've been dug in deep on that part of global change from the standpoint of communities at risk. And in the case of Elizabeth, also integrating a journey she made to Antarctica on one of the research vessels there a couple of years ago. It's a part of the world I've not been to. I've been to the Arctic 4 times, but it's a lot closer to the Northern Hemisphere than going to Antarctica, and takes sort of less effort to get there. Someday maybe, but we'll hear about that too. My guests are Madeline Ostrander, who's coming from Seattle. She's written a wonderful book, At Home on an Unruly Planet, Finding Refuge on a changing Earth, a changed Earth for sure. Great to have you here. Elizabeth Rush, who had written a book that was really a breakaway book at the time called Rising, about coastal and sea level change and how communities are, again, responding and not responding to the realities we face. I live 16 feet above sea level here in rural Maine, in Wabanaki territory, otherwise known as the outskirts of Ellsworth. And we had a king tide the last weekend that took us essentially to about 2060. The king tide was on top of our typical 11-foot high tide. It was about 13 feet. So it was like, okay, think about this as the normal high tide in 2060-ish, and go forward from there to what the king tide would be then. And it gives you a real sense of change and the need for adjustment. In some places it'll be retreat, in some places it'll be finding more resilient ways to live in zones of change. So it's just great to have you both here. Just start with a sort of how you are and where you are. So Madeline, did you grow up in the Northwest? I can't remember. Just tell us.
No, but I've lived here for more than a decade now, so it's pretty much home.
And yeah. What was the journey that took you to being a writer, as opposed to the other things you could do with your skills and brilliance?
Oh, wow. Let's see, how much of my life story should I share?
Well,
I mean, I guess I was one of those people that wanted to be a writer from when I was really young. And it's almost more like what took me to the science. But so I'm the daughter of a musician and an engineer. And I think that sort of put me in this space of being interested in both creativity and arts, and also in kind of an analytical way of looking at the world. And then I did degrees in both English and biology, and then a master's in environmental science. So that's kind of how I came to all of this. But I think that I always deep down wanted to be a writer.
Interesting. And like, was there a teacher or some moment early in your life that made, like, were you scrabbling, made up stories as a kid, or was it reading?
There were a number of teachers. I had a 6th grade teacher who was really encouraging. I had some teachers in high school. I edited the high school literary magazine.
Okay.
Yeah. So a few different people along the way.
And the environmental engineering or environmental focus, obviously, is that what led you toward thinking and inquiring around climate change?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I learned about climate change from a pretty young age from a grade school science teacher. And I think, though, that, after I came to Seattle, it started to becoming more real to me, probably around the time that it did for a lot of people. I think um, when Hurricane Katrina was in the news, and again when Hurricane Sandy was in the news, this sense of what it could mean for people personally and how horrific and troubling some of those impacts could be. And then when you're someone who writes about climate change, I think for a long time, those of us who've worked on the issue have had the sense that um, the sense of urgency that isn't always shared by people around us, and that's deeply it's been deeply frustrating, right? And so I've always been
Yeah.
striving to find ways to write this story so that people could get it in a visceral way, and not just in a sort of cognitive way that is easier to ignore, I think. um,
When you were developing the book proposal, was there a particular encounter you started to focus on? Or I know the fires, again, are a big part of a big chunk of what you did, but what was the sort of initiating example that made you think this is a book as opposed to a magazine story?
I mean, I think it started again with this question about how do we communicate this story of climate change in a way that is meaningful to people, and I was wrestling with that for a long time. I did a lot of reporting in environmental justice communities, and on stories, working with interviewing folks in vulnerable communities. And when I talk to folks in those communities, one thing I noticed is the way that people would frame climate change and every environmental issue as a question of community, as a question of how does this affect us here where we live? Because I think there was so much more of an awareness of, and just the way that the environmental justice community has organized itself is always around kind of home and community, and how do we protect the vulnerable communities that we live among. And so that felt really powerful and important to me when I was thinking about how do we talk about climate change. And so I think in a lot of ways, the book came out of the story of Richmond, because that was one of those places where I was reporting on environmental justice. And then also I was doing a lot of work on climate adaptation, which often also involves local questions. And so I brought some of that together into this book that talks about climate at home and what does it mean when we face these impacts where we live.
Yeah. Well, again, right here in Maine, one of the first things I did when we got here, we bought this house last November, moved here in June from the Hudson River Valley. Uh, I dug around on the idea of living shorelines. What do you do to foster a more dynamic, iterative relationship with the ocean when you're living by the shore? And there's a geologist who's worked in one part of Maine on a living shorelines project. How you can sort of facilitate, foster, sustaining the marshy border that's in between the waves and the woods. And I'm hoping to write about all that going forward. There's a lot of adjustments in Maine. Forests are changing. The Gulf of Maine is like completely changing in terms of temperature and like. We'll get back into your experience, Madeline, in a second. Elizabeth Rush, so you were telling me earlier you grew up in Massachusetts. You're now teaching at Brown University, my alma mater. And I guess is Corey Dean still there, or did she kind of retire?
I ran into her here probably 4 or 5 years ago, but I haven't seen her since. So
Okay.
maybe she's retired, but I don't want to say that for sure.
Yeah. Okay. She was my editor for a long time at the Times as a science editor. She asked me at one point to become her deputy, and that was like, and I was right. It was right when we were having our the first child with my wife now. He's now 24. So God, that's getting to be a long time ago. And I resisted. I just couldn't be an editor. I didn't want to go into the office on a daily basis. I was writing about the regional environment and global warming, and the idea of being desk hound just suit me. But her books have been on coastal change too. It should be
Totally.
fun. She'd be fun to have on here sometime. So what led you to focus on these? This is a tough subject. Your new book coming out is, we'll talk about it, but you went to Antarctica, 2019 or
That's right.
ish,
Yeah.
and you are also grappling with a question that many people are thinking about, who are young, parenthood in a world of epic change, and those two themes are being combined in what's coming out next year. But take me through the story, the journey that led to the rising. Why these are tough questions. Why, you could write essays and a book on anything. What drives you on this issue?
I mean, I think it comes back to something you just said about not wanting to like be an editor and be behind a desk. I, like Madeline, have spent a lot of time in the Pacific Northwest. I lived in Portland, Oregon, and did my undergraduate work there. And I actually like knew that I wanted to be some kind of nature writer when I graduated, but I also was like, oh, like everyone who lives in Oregon wants to be a nature writer. Like my odds were not great, right? Um, and so I ended up doing a lot of other kinds of writing for a while to make a living and make a name for myself. And then around 2010, I saw what felt like a bit of an opportunity I had written a lot about Southeast Asia, and I was like, I'm either going to keep working the Southeast Asia beat or I'm going to pivot towards environment. And that, as Madeline pointed out, is kind of right at this crux moment where these big storms are coming ashore and people are starting to think about them as like climate signals, but I don't think there was a lot of great reporting on what that meant and how it was impacting frontline communities and bringing those communities together. So much of what Madeline said resonates with me. And so I started doing a lot of reporting and research on sort of frontline flood climate change communities. And I grew tired of the kind of words that I had to use to kind of get those stories into the newspaper. So I started using my background, initial training as a poet, and like really cooked up this much more lyrical approach to writing about climate change, and also an approach that really centered the voices of those living on the front lines. And that's kind of how Rising came about. It took like 7 years to write. Like there's a lot more that happened in there, but
Wow.
it also just grows out of that sense of loving to be in the world, even if the world is changing sort of irrevocably all around you. I also didn't want to have my butt in a chair all the time. I wanted assignments and work that brought me in contact with people and places. And so, I think that's true. Even going to Antarctica is part of that, right?
Yeah, and that's a big commitment, by the way, going to Antarctica. I think Jeff Goodell was on the vessel with you. Were there any other journalists?
There was one other, Carolyn Beeler, who is a broadcast journalist. So there was Jeff, who did a lot of really fabulous reporting for Rolling Stone. Carolyn Beeler did audio storytelling for PRI in the World. And I thought of myself as more like the writer on board. I did a couple of short pieces for National Geographic, but I've really been working on turning that journey and the journey towards motherhood into a book length work, which will come out next August.
Um, tell me about Milkweed Press too. They're pretty cool.
Milkweed's great. Madeline and I have been meaning to talk about Milkweed too.
It's a good time.
Yeah, I had to laugh like as I was shopping around the manuscript of Rising. I remember one press, I'm not going to say who because it really doesn't matter, but they were like, oh, we're interested, but we want you to write the Cadillac Desert of sea level rise. And I was sort of like, I mean, that book is 700 pages long. Like, I'm sure I want to write that book. It's a lot of archival research is what that book is. And Milkweed instead really got what the project was about. They understood the lyricism. They understood the like formal ingenuity in terms of having other people speak that were not me. And my editor there, Joey McGarvey, she and I have developed this like really fabulous relationship. I worked with her in the new book too. You know, she reads my work and would write me like 13-page editorial letters in response, and she line edited everything. She's since she just started at Spiel and Grau, another indie publishing house. But I think what I'm trying to say is like Milkweed is small. They publish 20, 25 books a year. Most of them are environmentally focused, and because they're small, they want each of their books to succeed, and they invest a lot in them, from like real editorial attention to, intense attention to the publicity around a book. You know, if you publish with an indie publishing house, like your book's well-being and success is their success. And I found a really great home at Milkweed.
And maybe I'll ask you both. And by the way, you can ask each other questions too. We could just chat. This is, an open conversation. But Madeline, there's been such a surge of books on climate in the last few years. It kind of blows my mind. Somewhere here, I have my 1992 global warming book. But back then things were quieter. It was Bill McKibben. There was, it was probably maybe 50 books a year. And now it's hundreds, maybe more. So how did you cut through and find a way to tell the story the way you wanted to tell it for your book, Madeline?
I mean, I think that the feeling I had, the story that I didn't feel was getting told enough, was about communities. I think that we still tend to write about climate change as a big, vast issue, and even some of the best known recent books to come out, like David Wallace Wells's book, The Uninhabitable Earth, and many other books. Like, a lot of Naomi Klein's books, for instance, are about activism, but they're talking about things on a pretty large scale, or pretty abstract framing. And I felt like there's that, or there's writing about, should you be a vegan or not, or, kind of smaller scale individual choices that really are reflective of our culture's hyper individualization and focus on tiny consumer choices. But I think there's a lot of powerful things that happen at the level of community, things that I was seeing in the communities that I was reporting on. And I think that people have a lot more influence and ability to create change at that level than maybe they realize. And I also think that when people see it as a community level issue, and I mean, not that climate change exists at all of the scales, right? I mean, it's global, and it's affecting all us, our day-to-day lives at this point. But I think when people see it as a community scale issue, it's easier for them to kind of get on board. It's sometimes possible to get around some of the divisiveness that has overshadowed this issue. And I just wanted to try to frame some stories in that way. And I didn't see a lot of work being done in that area. I mean, there is some other writing, including Elizabeth's, which is why we're all here in a conversation. But there's not a ton of those stories, I think, still.
Yeah. Do you have your sense? I was just going to ask if you have a sense of why. Of course, totally. Yeah.
I'm so curious. I loved your book, and thinking about community and how you chose to write it. You have these you have sections that are in italics that are kind of like mixed in with your sections, and that, as I read them, are sort of the people that you're interviewing. It's their voices coming in and kind of like taking control of the story as it unfolds on the page. Could you talk a little bit more about that and the choice to write that way? It felt so fresh and new for me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. That's exactly the way that you're interpreting it is exactly what I was going for. First of all, I wanted to not just foreground my own experience. I didn't want it to be just the reporter parachutes in and talks about what's happening in these places. I think that kind of writing is really valuable in some cases, but I think that sometimes as a reader, even, I find myself longing for more of the story to come through and not always just the reporter's voice. And particularly because I was writing about frontline communities, and I was writing about, some communities of color. I'm writing also from a community in Alaska that's facing relocation. I wanted to sort of share the page with some of those voices. And I also wanted to have these sections that were reconstructed narratives about things that had happened in the history of these communities, where I was going back through memories with people, and they were, sometimes telling me things repeatedly or telling me different details at different moments. And it was awkward to just put conventional quotes around them, because I felt like that held me to this kind of rigidity about like exactly how they were saying it, when and in what place. So for all of those reasons, I in those narrative sections of the book, I chose to put some of the quotes in italics so that the people that I had interviewed could tell part of the story with me. And so the book goes back and forth between those sections that are those narratives in the deeper, somewhat past, or narratives where I'm not in the action as a reporter, and then parts where I am in the action and I'm quoting people directly.
That makes sense to me. I hadn't thought about it as like, oh, this is a recounting of the past, and hence, therefore, you're going to be a little bit less present in it. But that makes a ton of sense. And it's sort of like you're letting the community members tell their community's history. We don't need so much of the like reporter reconstructing it as much as it's engaging to listen to them talk about what happened. I really appreciated that about your book.
Thank you. The first part I wrote, which is not the first part of the book, are the 2 chapters about Newtok, Alaska. And because there's so many voices in that community, that also I think was a reason why I made that choice at that point. I had to make some structural choices about how are these chapters going to feel. And I think that was a place where it felt especially important to me to share the page, and also had to have different voices appearing in the story. And then that just became how I wrote the rest of the book.
Do you think that one of the reasons this approach is not dominant, or isn't what you hear the most in sort of the discourse around climate change, is that one of the things I think you both reveal in your writing is that there's a lot of diversity of experience on the ground. What you see often are these kind of cartoonish Bangladesh sinking stories. And when I've not been to Bangladesh, but I wrote a piece like on .earth at the Times, maybe 12 years ago, where I got a hold of some engineers there who were working on ways to channel the sediment coming down from the mountains and sustain Bangladesh. They were bridling against the idea that they're doomed. And the narrative, the general narrative, which is very easy to convey, is, oh my God, we're all doomed. Is that diversity of experience part of why I think it's one reason I gravitate to your writing, both of you. But I didn't know if that's part of what you see as well. There's no one narrative out of an Arctic village. There's no one narrative in the Amazon, that's for sure. Is that part of it?
I'm like, Madeline, you answer and then I'll follow up.
Okay. Well, I guess, one of the things I've thought about is just how labor intensive it is to get some of these stories, and especially to tell them well. When I'm reporting, even in a community that's not so far from me, in Richmond, California, or, across the mountains in Okanagan County, the amount of time and labor it takes to really dig into those perspectives and write them in a way that's not just a sort of cookie cutter cartoonish story like, look, the West is burning. I mean, you know, that's kind of one of the dominant narratives out here, which I think, I mean, the West is burning, and we do need to reckon with the fact that we're having these, like, you know, really catastrophic fires, but there's so many other stories that could be told about recovery, about forest restoration, about the ways ecologists and scientists are thinking about how to manage those changes in the landscape, but they require time, and they require really sitting with people and interviewing them. And if you're talking about a community that's gone through trauma, I think to do it sensitively, you have to really invest the time. And that's something that not a lot of journalists have, because either people are based in, you know, in cities like New York, or they're just, you know, just to make a living. Like, it's not easy to get sent on assignment to hang out in a place for a long time. One of the sort of privileges of being able to write a book is that you can slow down and take that time to listen to places like this.
Mm-hmm. What experiences, Elizabeth, did you have that are kind of like that?
I mean, I'm nodding along. I'm like, absolutely. That's absolutely true. Like, time is what you need. And then as soon as you spend a lot of time somewhere, the story doesn't settle easily into like a linear singular narrative. I think about it a lot. I can maybe talk about it sort of anecdotally related to this project that I have that's coming out, which is about being part of this really groundbreaking research expedition to the calving edge of the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, like a place literally before we went, no human beings had ever been there before in the history of the planet, which is kind of wild to think about. And as I prepared to go on that journey, I thought I did a lot of research into how Antarctica has been represented. Like, what are the stories that we tell about it? And it took me like 3 months to realize that to realize sort of two fundamental things. The first person to see Antarctica in the history of the planet saw Antarctica in 1820. So like any nonfiction writing about Antarctica in the history of the world has happened in the last 200 years. That's crazy. And then to realize that the overwhelming majority of the stories sort of recycle the same events. It's like you get Shackleton's failed expedition, you get Scott and Admison's race for the pole and Scott dying on the return. You get Mawson shooting and eating his sled dogs. And like all of these stories are sort of not so subtly stories of male conquest. And I became really interested in like what's left out of those stories that focus on a singular, seemingly exceptional individual. And so when I went on that boat on this icebreaker for 3 months, I was like, it can't, very much what Madeline was talking about. Like, this can't just be about me. In fact, in many ways, it's not about me. That felt really important. And so I ended up basically choosing like 25 people on board the boat who I would check in with at regular interviews and interview them and ask them to like narrate their day-to-day experience. And I did, I think, 243 interviews while on board, and I transcribed them all. And because there's no internet at the bottom of the earth, I like didn't even use transcription software. I was like transcribing them by hand every day in the hull of the ship. And what resulted for me was this idea that if we're going to tell a story about this expedition, it has to be a story that's told with many voices, that like, and there are moments that really one person's experience is at odds with someone else's experience, or there's really interesting moments where they very much echo each other. I think, you know, the day when we finally arrive at the edge of this glacier that has literally been pulling all of us towards it for months, sometimes years, I narrate that briefly in my body, but then I narrate it from the perspective of all the different people looking at this ice for the first time. And that to me felt like it actually captured how both, awesome it was to be there and how terrifying and awful it was to be there. And people are able to sort of like, I'm able to give that moment a kind of emotional depth that I think doesn't flatten it. And so, yeah, lots of voices is something that I've become even more sort of committed to as a formal choice the longer I write about climate.
And I think maybe it was one of the essays you wrote, like the one in Orion, among the other medical tests and other things you had to do before you go, you had to demonstrate you were not pregnant. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
It makes sense. I understand but that gets at the whole motherhood question, obviously, too.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that's true. Pregnant women in the US program are banned from being on the ice, and like it does at some level make sense. And I also think it like does something to how we talk about Antarctica and how Antarctica is sort of like coded as this like barren outpost at the bottom of the earth that has potential apocalyptic resonances for us. There's lots of ways to think about Antarctica. Antarctica and the Southern Ocean like sets the globe's weather patterns. It is one of the most abundant marine environments in the world. Like there's a lot of other ways to think about Antarctica as opposed to just like the highest, driest, coldest, windiest, most awfulest place on the planet. And I really wanted to push back against some of the way that we figure Antarctica because it shapes us just as much as we shape it. So I wanted to think of it as a place of like beginnings or possibility. And I do think that sort of like prohibition against female bodies carrying life there, and women being literally banned from the ice for much of the last 2 centuries. Like it impacts the stories we've told about it. So I kind of came up with this idea of like, what if I hold motherhood and Antarctica in the same space? And so that's also kind of at play in this weird book that I wrote that's coming out.
Sorry, go. No, go.
Well, it brings up for me some gender questions that I think are not explicit in my book, but that I noticed as I was writing it. And one of the things is that there are a lot of women in my book. And at one point I actually wondered for a moment, like, do I not have enough men in this book? I was trying to be very representational, because I wanted the book to convey a range of experiences that people can be having with the climate crisis. And I'm writing across these 4 different communities. But the people who emerged in the book just tended to be women. And I think it was something to do with the way that I framed the book around community and the sorts of people who are bringing community together. And maybe, I haven't done a deep gender analysis of this, but I guess I would say that like some of that emotional labor of bringing community together and organizing at that level, fits in with gender roles that we often assign to women. And those are also really powerful roles in terms of climate resilience, bringing people together and building resilience. And like, for instance, Carly Nander is one of the important characters in the Okanagan County story in my book. It has this incredible role as a mayor and a firefighter and runs a daycare center and brings this huge gathering of people together to talk about recovery. And I do think that perhaps that has something to do with the work that we think of as being traditionally for women. And I think that we probably need to be giving more attention to that community building work and how important it is in terms of resilience and in terms of how we respond to the climate crisis.
God, you're reminding me of a interview I did with Deanne Criswell, who's now the head of FEMA. in the 90s, she was a firefighter in the Air Force and then in Colorado. And she is leading FEMA now. And I did this long conversation with her and with the who's heading the U.S. Fire Administration, I think it's called. And they both kind of embody significantly what you're talking about at the community scale, but kind of coming forward into the more, governmental leadership capacity. I don't know if this gives you, it feels like very hopeful to me to learn more and more about what you're talking about. And what I try to do in my program, or at least in my webcast, is knowing that, just as you were saying, both of you were saying earlier, it's really hard to kind of spend the time to get the full prismatic diversity of voices on the ground, to get the trust, to get what can we do to actually facilitate their telling their own stories, like stepping completely out to the side.
Mhm.
I've been trying to do what I call friendly takeovers of this webcast, where students and faculty where I can like get out of the freaking picture, what tools, and so I'm encouraged by two things. One is how women are becoming more part of the sort of leadership, even at larger scales. The insights from both of them were just great to learn. And the other is just thinking about these tools. This may seem weird. No, I think this is relevant. I don't know if you know about the documentary Picture a Scientist, which came out a year and a half ago. And it started with the premise that when kids are asked to draw a scientist, it's always a guy in a white coat. And the film was about the abuses and the barriers that women face in getting into science. It's amazing. But like with books and like with other documentaries, they were going on tours to campuses, having events at the National Academy of Sciences. But then they did this. They created an Instagram campaign for women in science to post their own experiences, including abuse, which comes in all varieties, competitive, destructive behavior, sexual abuse, etc. And I think about this as a great example of like, if they're with a book, it takes more work or whatever. Is there a way we can think about with the output, the work that we do as writers to liberate or to amplify or to ramify more? This felt like an example of what can be done. And I don't know, again, it would take a lot of work. You as a writer don't have the time to develop an Instagram campaign or around your books and the like, but do you feel that could be a way to take the vision you encapsulated in both books and build the conversation around it for people who are sort of below the radar?
I feel like one thing I've been doing, Andy, is, I totally agree. And I feel like my work at some level is about handing over my microphone. Like, I have a platform, I have a microphone. I'm a good storyteller, so let me help you craft your story so that it's artful. And then like your story can take up space in the thing that I made in a way that feels like it maintains the agency of the speaker. So I feel like that happens on the page. But one thing I've been doing lately, because that also doesn't always feel like enough, is I've been doing free workshops in frontline climate change communities on how to write an op-ed. And
You have been?
yeah.
Oh, is
And
that
so
through the op-ed project or just on
I
your own?
use some of their resources, but I just kind of do it on my own. It's something that I do. I've done a lot with the Anthropocene Alliance, which is the nation's largest
Right.
network of frontline climate changed communities fighting for just environmental climate adaptation. So they're the Anthropocene Alliance, and they're amazing. But I also have been doing it like as I continue to, do climate change work and interviews. I've been trying to say to folks, thank you for your time. If there's anything I can do, including leading a writing workshop for members of your community, let me know. And so I've done some with like folks who are organizing to stop the construction of the Mountain Valley pipeline, and things like that. So,
That's
It's
great.
hard to make the time, but I felt that it's been important to recognize that like my writing is one thing I can do, but it's maybe not the only thing I can do.
That's really cool. And I haven't asked you what you teach at Brown, or are you in a kind of a scholarly role or teaching or?
I love teaching, although right now I'm like, oh, I wish I could be in a scholarly role. I have like 30 papers to grade.
Oh my God.
I teach creative nonfiction. So intro to advanced seminars. I teach a class on testimonial storytelling. I'm going to teach a class in the spring with a really great environmental historian, Bathsheba DeMuth, called Narrating the Anthropocene. So I get, I think it's maybe easy for me to transition to teaching those workshops because I teach writing here at Brown.
And Madeline, I'd like to ask you both, and again, if you have questions, you just want to talk, it's fine. I'll ask you, each of you, do you think it's possible to have a good Anthropocene?
Oh, wow. Glenn Albrecht, whose work I talk about in the book. So Glenn Albrecht is an Australian philosopher who came up with this concept called solastalgia, which is the idea that we are starting to feel homesick, or we can feel homesickness because of environmental damage to areas that we live in, and particularly as climate change shifts the places that we're familiar with and makes them less recognizable. So he has this whole kind of lexicon around like environmental emotions and trying to come up with new language for our experiences. Anyway, he doesn't like the word Anthropocene and thinks that it suggests something very destructive, and he thinks that we should move towards something he calls the Symbiocene, which I think would be an era in which we have a better sense of our connectedness to the planet. So hence the symbio beginning. I mean, whether that's possible or not, the evidence is pretty clear that things are going to get worse before they get better. And I think the question is, can we actually make them better? And sometimes sorry, I'm stopping mid-sentence to answer this because I realize that in a way I don't allow myself to fully ask the question of what it would look like if we don't. I feel like to some degree we have a responsibility to try to imagine what it's like if we do and keep pushing toward the best outcome we can get. And I don't think I'm not sure that I think it's productive to sort of hang around and think about, or is this a guarantee, or I think those projections are valuable, but I think that to the large extent, like the work of those of us who are working on the climate crisis is to try to push as much as possible to accomplish whatever is accomplishable. I don't know if that's a very good answer. It's a big question, but
it is a big. Well, this comes up all the time these days. Elena Wood has basically given up on Twitter because so many people who are climate concerned were attacking her for saying it's not so bad. Jacqueline Gill, a friend of mine right down a few dozen miles away here in Maine, again, constant abuse for stating the reality that there are trajectories that can get us through this, and being punished from the left. So this is an issue that's important to grapple with. It is a complex one, and no one can prove the case in either direction. So Elizabeth, again, good Anthropocene. Doable.
Again, I'm right there with Madeline. I always think about it as like, how would I put it? I'm really uncomfortable with the like doomsday narratives because I think they're often generated by people who don't understand that even a fraction of a degree is like a meaningful difference. And so I think of it as like, yeah, we have to fight for every single fraction of a degree right now. And every single fraction of a degree we keep the planet from warming, helps lessen the stress that we put on human and non-human communities. Like, so I'm not sure if I want to talk about good or bad Anthropocene, but like think about it as it's always on a big scale. And if, I want us to be as close to, this end of the scale than the far end of the scale. And I think that that's a worthwhile fight. But I also, something I've been thinking about a lot is that I have a group of climate change writers that I meet with every 2 months or so, and we tend to read a different book every 2 months and talk about it. And something I've realized in being part of that group of people is that we're all wired a little differently, and like some of us tend to be more on like the doomer end of things, and some of us tend to be more on the optimistic end of things. And I don't actually need there to be one narrative. Like, I think some people are going to respond more actively to a story that, is about building a world that we want to live in. And some other people might respond more actively to like, oh my God, there's a horrible crisis coming. We have to avert it. Like, I don't think that all of us respond in the same way, right? Like, we're all different people. And so, I don't exactly know how to translate that as an answer to your question, but like, it will be what it will be. We are partly in charge of that. And may there be many stories as it takes to help people get engaged.
Totally. Well, I'm with you completely on that. I wrote a long essay in 2016 around when I had my 30th year on the climate beat. And it was like, what have I learned and unlearned? And one of a really important juncture for me came in, it was around Keystone and Obama, 2011-ish. And I was kind of taking a macro view of oil demand and pipelines and being wonky, kind of as David Roberts, his label for people like me at the time was a VSP, a very, what do you call it? Very serious person. and and this is when Bill McKibben was chaining himself to the fences in Washington. And so I had a different view of whether Obama should, in time of vulnerability for the Democrats, really put the no Keystone thing in the foreground. And David really went at me. We're friends and stuff, but and Bill, I on .earth, my blog, I posted a message from Bill McKibben. Like, it was like a letter from the Birmingham jail, but it was a letter from being arrested in Washington. And he was basically saying, if you're not here, in Washington getting arrested, you're not serious about this. And I'm like, well, actually, I am very serious about this. I've spent all my life writing about it. And I started to think, well, my God, can we embrace diversity? Can we embrace the fact that within the community of concern about addressing the climate problem, can we be comfortable with people who are pro-nuclear, people who are all renewables, people who are, completely about the justice question, people who are completely about the technology question? And of course, we need all, as you were saying, we need all of that. So it's not a one voice thing. It's not convincing the world to have the same frame of reference as you do. But I think that's really hard for this community. I don't know. Madeline, do you run into this? You're focused on adaptation and resilience, and then there's a whole community that's all about mitigation. It's all about cutting emissions. You're wasting time.
Mm-hmm.
Does this kind of get to you sometimes, or do you see this? Or
I did write about that adaptation and mitigation. I don't want to call it a divide because it's not a divide anymore, but I think the people it's not a divide among the professionals and experts who work on adaptation and mitigation. It is, I think, often misunderstood by some people still in the climate community who aren't as clear about those two frames of reference and how they fit together. But yeah, early on, in the climate world, people who were talking about adaptation were sort of shunned a little bit because it was seen as a distraction from trying to cut emissions. I think most folks who are in the science part of things anyway understand that you have to do both at once.
For
And
sure.
furthermore, you can't, build a solar farm in an area that's gonna, or a wind farm or whatever in an area that doesn't have any kind of storm protection, for instance, or you can't, you can't design a mitigation project, a project to cut emissions if it's gonna fail because of the impacts of climate change. So you have to think about both things at the same time. And furthermore, there's so many vulnerabilities that we're facing. There's so much potential suffering that we need to try to avert, given the impacts that are happening now and coming down the road. So I haven't really. I mean, I don't get hit too often with somebody saying that we shouldn't adapt. We should only cut emissions. But I do think that rigidity is there in other ways. I think in a way it's common to fields, including folks who work on COVID, fields where the science has been attacked a lot. And so people feel like there has to be one position that we defend. And I think it's really important to come to a place where we can talk openly about the different kinds of solutions that are possible so that we can find our way through this and not just to defend one side or the other. And I think that was part of what I found hopeful about focusing on community, is that when there are community stories, people can have a practical conversation about whether you build a seawall or whether you look into some sort of massive engineering project, or what homeowners can do or how much it costs. And it becomes a much more nuts and bolts conversation and not a conversation about something highly theoretical and divisive.
I'm with you there too. I did this piece, I can't remember when. Oh yeah, just a year ago, when the infrastructure bill was coming out, the first big package, the $1 trillion bipartisan one. And, the question, because I'd written about this before in terms of disaster recovery, was what can be done really in government to foster the capacity to get resources to communities that not only need it, but that lack the ability to even know it's there. This piece I did was about how billionaires, FEMA's structure right now is such that the decision on investing money is based on how much value there is. And the value is only measuring like the wealth and in a community. So that's why billionaires in the Hamptons get to protect their beaches with federal dollars. And how do we build back better for whom? I think that question can be better answered by doing exactly what you both have been trying to do. We're doing in your first book, Elizabeth, and in your book, Madeline, which is to give voice to these communities. And now how can we translate that into power for these communities? Feels like a really important opportunity, especially the next 10 years, because now there's literally tens of billions of dollars per year to spend on both resilience and on energy transitions. That could go really wrong if the tools aren't there to bring those voices out.
I have to say, Andy, you're making me think of something that this woman, Susie Mosier, who's like a really amazing voice in the climate adaptations.
I love her.
Yeah, right? Everyone, like, if you know her, you're like, yeah, she's wise in a way that is, anytime I speak with her, she says something that I, carry with me for a long time. And one of the things she said to me was one of the big barriers to getting adaptation funding and federal funding to lower income communities is that they just don't have the property taxes to hire civil servants to apply for, go after these like grants that are really burdensome in terms of like the application process and the bureaucracy to get access to the money. So she advocates for like using some funds that have been made available for building green infrastructure to hire like an adaptation specialist for, whatever, every 50 miles of coastline or every 100 miles of coastline, or, make it not about property taxes, but about trying to get sort of equal access to those funds for all. And I was like, oh, I don't know, for every 100,000 people, like however you want to think about it. And I feel like that could be, if anyone's listening out there, can we please do that?
There's one other aspect of her work that I'm sure you'll both embrace. The first time I talked to her about, she's got this project she's been trying to work on for years on fostering what she calls the adaptive mind. And to me, that translates into adaptive communities. And it's, look at what she tweeted about this many, many times. She's been on the show before, but let me just show you what she thinks of when she thinks of the adaptive mind.
And I'm just going to take this little pause in the airwaves right now to say that I unfortunately have to leave because I teach class in 4 minutes.
Okay.
But this has been wonderful, and I really appreciate both of you so much. Let's do this again.
I've had these sitting next to me.
Hold them up. Hold on. Before you go. It's just been great to. Oh, this is wonderful. We moved here recently enough that my books are still in boxes. Thank you both. I want to continue that thought on Susie, even if Elizabeth, you have to go. Tell your students, by the way, they should come on the show sometime. They should run a show.
Okay.
Elizabeth, I could send you a link on how to do that.
Okay.
And thank you so much. Good luck with the rollout of your next book. Remind me of the title again.
The Quickening.
The Quickening.
Creation and Community at the Ends of the Earth.
So great. And that's next summer, probably, right?
Yes.
It's exciting.
Awesome.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Madeline, just because I think have you interacted with Moser much?
Yeah, I interviewed her. It's been a little while, but I interviewed her for some stories I did on sea level rise, particularly one that I did in the Los Angeles area. Yeah, and I agree that she says some rather profound things about sea level, including about sort of the limits to what we can actually accomplish, because of course, holding back the sea is a serious prospect in some cases. So
well, it's I had on here recently Erica Gies, who wrote The Water Always Wins.
Yes, exactly.
So here's this concept of the adaptive mind, a set of propensities, leadership skills, and capacities that allow an individual embedded in social networks and institutions to respond with agility, creativity, resolve, and resilience to these things: constant change, including surprises, rapid shifts, pervasive uncertainty and not knowing, anticipatory, vicarious, and/or direct traumatic experience, challenges associated with deep systemic and transformative change. These are all qualities that emerge in the people that you were in your book, for sure. I mean, not everyone, but
yeah, certainly the people who who are at the forefront of the book are people who have been able to deal with something sometimes pretty catastrophic and come forward with ways of transforming that situation. I like that she's framing it as talking about the psychological aspect of adaptation, because I think that is a serious challenge that we face. I mean, it's difficult in terms of mental and emotional health to deal with some of the kinds of crises that we're dealing with, and also just to change our thinking about how we've done things for decades or sometimes centuries. And that's part of the big challenge of how to respond to this crisis, is how do we become more adaptive in the way that we think.
And it's a learning journey all the way through. That also I had on Christy Ebi, who's a climate and health expert right there at University of Washington in Seattle. She was on here during the heat wave, and she said, I wrote this. She really bridles at the idea, the phrase "new normal." because she feels it locks in a sense that what you're experiencing now is a new normal compared to what was, as opposed to there's no new normal. We're on this perpetual motion machine. Change is changing, and that requires, well, the adaptive mind, skill sets that probably have been sort of dormant in areas of the world where we've been sort of fat and happy, and there are lessons to learn from places that are where resilience is a fundamental part of how you have to get through the day, let alone the century. So thanks so much, Madeline Ostrander, for being here today on this edition of Sustain What, Columbia Climate School webcast. It's like the 350th one I've done since the early days of the pandemic. I hope everyone will explore your book, which I was going to show here again, but I have too many things open on my screen.
Yeah, I'll wave it up.
Hold it up. Hold up. Yes. Yes. At home on an unruly planet. We are all at home on we're on an unruly planet. We have to find a way to feel at home.
Yeah.
And to work at fostering that capacity all around us. The other thing that Christy Ebai and so many others working in resilience say is that, and this is my response to the doomers, is that walk down your block, go to the other side of your town, wherever you are, there's someone who's facing vulnerability of one way or the other that you can help to mitigate. So mitigating emissions is important, but every community on the planet has the capacity to, with more empathy, more awareness, and now with all the resources here in the United States coming through the federal government, literally more capacity if those tools are put to the right use. So thanks again. Come back sometime. Maybe I'll have you both back with Susie Moser, and we'll keep the conversation going. This is Andy Revkin, the Sustain What webcast, and if all those out there share this as soon as we're done. Whatever link you're watching on, you can share with others. It'll be the archive form of the video. I'll write up the results on my Substack, revkin.substack.com, and go forward and to the weekend and beyond. Take care.
Thanks, Andy.